Newspapers and the rise of modern journalism. Well, first I want to start with a cartoon from Doonesbury, and it's kind of an apt cartoon because it shows, well, for one thing, it's a cartoon that's been in newspapers for, I don't know, 30 years. Actually longer than that, because it was around during the Vietnam War, and in fact the people we see here are Boopsie in the first panel, and she was a cheerleader during the 70s, and then her husband there is BD, and he was a football player before he went to the war. Actually, he's an Iraqi war veteran. Anyway, so Boopsie, who's also a high school principal, so she's had it with cable news and their 24-hour chatter. She turns it off and she says, "Forget it, I'm going back to newspapers, to the old way to get news." And he says, "Well, I'm way ahead of you," and he's already subscribed to a new newspaper. But then we go outside and we see their daughter, and there she is, the new generation, and she sees the newspaper. She doesn't know what it is. She's poking at it with a stick and comments that it looks like a limp iPad. Well, that's part of the newspaper industry's issue in a way, in that it's seen as a very much old media. But as you'll see, newspapers have as much new media as anybody else for the most part. They're very current now, very immediate, in a way that they weren't certainly 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago. And they've been criticized, newspapers, for being a little bit late to the new business model, and that could have contributed to the decline in readership. But then there were other contributing factors as well, including just what a new generation of people wants and how it wants to consume news, as well as the many electronic opportunities that are available now that weren't even 5 years ago. So let's take a look. Why does anybody read newspapers? Why should you read newspapers? Well, here's a few reasons. To make informed decisions is my favorite, but also newspapers are great for entertainment. Like there was an Oldsmobile commercial that says, "This isn't your dad's Oldsmobile." Well, I would say this isn't your dad's newspaper anymore. Most newspapers, we'll look through the Los Angeles Times and the many opportunities for diversion there are there. Yes, you can get in-depth news, but you can also read about fashion and pop culture and celebrity gossip and recipes, travel, vacations, and the list goes on and on. Okay, so we'll look at some of those sections in just a little bit. But to stay current, to help you make decisions about how to vote, for instance, and I kind of half-jokingly say to have stuff to talk about at parties, but really, informed people do have more things to talk about, and they don't have to say, "I heard this" or "I heard that," and not be sure of it, because they read it in a credible source. And it matters not whether it's in paper or online. It's still news from a credible source, because it's a professional journalistic organization if it's a good newspaper. And the last thing I suggest here, another reason to read newspapers, is for civil discourse. And although in the next slide it appears that, let's see, am I going to get there? Yeah, that civil discourse, according to this editorial cartoon, may be dead, or they're preparing to bury it. But what it means is, discussions over issues. California has an interesting initiative process in that even if the legislature doesn't pass a bill, the voters can. And so in California in particular, we have a very important reason to have civil discourse, to talk about the initiatives that are on our ballot, in addition to the federal elections and all the other ways we make decisions, or even just local decisions. Do you want a new mall, or do you, if you're one of the people who live in the cities where they're cutting down trees in order for the Space Shuttle Endeavour to be transported from Los Angeles International Airport to the California Science Center, you needed to know about that. And how did you know that was going to happen? You could read about it in your newspaper. You could also hear about it on TV, but newspaper will give you, whether it's online or in print, a little more in-depth and usually more sources for your story. Okay, well, let's take a look at the print edition. This isn't even really a recent picture, but that's what the front of the LA Times looks like if you get it in a print edition, and it can be, that's any given day. They're newsy, but they're more diverse. There's all kinds of different typefaces. There's a lot of color. There's graphics and photos and action shots. And sometimes they even have stuff on, as I was saying before, on pop culture that'll land right there on the front page. But then when you go online, then you have the diversity and the choices, just like you would have whether you were looking online at any other kind of online site. You can choose from any kind of subject, the news of the day, the breaking news at that moment, or the big picture in politics. And the good thing about online is that it's searchable and it's archived. So that means that if you look at today's paper and there's a story on the innocence of Muslims film that caused so much uproar in the Middle East, and you go back and you say, now what was, whoops, excuse me for going ahead there, you might want to go back and say, what was the big deal about that film? Well, you could find it just by searching the archives. And of course, if you only had a print edition, you'd have to go back through old papers that you may or may not still have hanging around. So the online edition has a tremendous advantage in that it's archived and it's searchable. I love that about them. Now, the downside is that if you work all day on the computer, like I do when I'm not in the classroom, then maybe you really don't want to sit there and read more stuff at your leisure on the computer. I find I'm looking for a different medium at the end of the day, or even in the beginning of the day, if I can. But there's nothing like the convenience of the availability online. The other thing that you can do with online is you can set it up for yourself. You can choose, I only want to read this, or only feed me stories about that. And what, let's say you only care about sports, or you only care about celebrity gossip. That's a great way to narrow your the information that's put before you, so that you don't have to page through it to find what you're interested in. The downside is the same as the upside, which is that you don't have to page through real news to get to the only thing you're interested in if it's sports. So you don't even have the opportunity to really have it flash before you as you glance and read headlines about what's going on in the news. And sometimes the headline is enough to just spark our interest to get us to read the first few paragraphs, and that's enough to get us interested in a topic and make us look for more on it. So if you're just getting the news feed on just one topic, that can be an issue. I guess from my own personal perspective, I'd urge you to click more boxes on if you're looking at a Yahoo news feed, click more boxes than just the one that you care most about. This is a slide from the LA Times travel section, and it's one of the best around. It's, you can search it if you've ever, you're planning a vacation somewhere and you want to see if anything's been written about it. You know that if you're reading it here or in any other newspaper of renown, excuse me, that was my email, which I'll close. But you'll know that if you're reading it there, you'll know that that story has been written by a news writer. The organization that that writer traveled with, the restaurants where that writer ate, and the hotels where that writer stayed do not know that there is an LA Times writer staying, eating, or traveling with them. That's not revealed until somebody sees it in the paper and goes, oh, maybe that was maybe that guy was on our trip. I don't know, because they want to be absolutely objective. So if you see it there, you know it's not one of the sponsored links. You know it's not just some blogger, or not that bloggers don't have value, but you know this person wasn't paid to say something good about a certain trip. You know you're going to get the whole complete story. This is another section that's so nice, the science section or the health section, and you get all kinds of stories of the day on what's the latest in health, and of course sports. Lots of people like sports. I already talked about personalized options. So I'm going to transition now just a little bit into the history of newspapers and how we got to the moment we are in today. And here we are with a picture of one of the very first colonial papers. You know, in today's journalism, we talk a lot about objectivity and the quest for the absence of bias in real journalists. And it's odd to realize that when journalism began in this country, when newspapers began, we didn't have any qualms about absence of bias or objectivity. They were created to essentially raise the rabble. They were partisan press, and the idea was to really get people behind the cause, to overthrow, well, to go to war against the king. That was the main purpose of a lot of the partisan press in that era. Here I'm clicking through some of these slides showing you some of the earliest newspapers. Here the New England Courant was one that was considered the newspaper to read just to interest or engage just ordinary readers, as opposed to the more historic Pennsylvania Gazette and some of the other newspapers. By about 1729, we had Benjamin Franklin. Of course, you all know his name from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the work to put together the country that became the United States. And here you see that one of the very first publishers, John Peter Zenger, of what was called the New York Weekly Journal, was arrested for what they called seditious libel, and that's because he was speaking against the king. By 1765, there were only about 30 newspapers in the American colonies, but that's pretty good considering how small the colonies were and how difficult it was to transport papers. It wasn't like you could put them on a UPS truck or airplane. They had to be delivered by Pony Express or just delivered locally. By 1784, you had the first daily newspapers, and we see there were political and commercial. But really, it was the parties, the political parties that shaped the early newspapers. And you see there that circulations were in the hundreds, not in the thousands, not in the tens of thousands. Here we have some more of the early newspapers, and we entered an era called the penny press, and we'll see that when we get to books as well. And that was when newspapers became very affordable. And when things become affordable, they become more available and more accessible to the ordinary people and the middle class. And this was another way to spread literacy, but in these cases also to spread partisan politics, essentially. These penny press newspapers, one of the things that they did was increase their reliance on on advertising revenue. So you didn't need to, so the newspapers didn't rely on people paying for the newspapers by buying each individual newspaper because they were so cheap. Instead, they used the advertising dollar to sustain the business model. So I hope that's kind of understandable. If they could get more people to read the paper by making the prices cheaper, then they could get more advertising revenue. And why is that true? Because the more people who read the paper, the more valuable it is to an advertiser. And this model is actually the current day model of advertising and newspapers. Before I go much farther, I want to mention that in 1848, as the newspaper industry was growing up in this country, the Associated Press was formed, and it was then called a wire service because that's how the news stories were transmitted, was over the telegraph wire. But what they did, here's the premise behind the Associated Press, and there are many other news wire services that are still called today. The premise is that if the New England Current or the New York Morning Herald or even today's New York Times, it has a big newspaper like the New York Times has foreign reporters in foreign countries around the world. But it can't hit every country, and the smaller newspapers, like in our area, the Ventura County Star, which is a big local newspaper, but its circulation is less than 100,000 compared to, say, 1 million. So it doesn't have the kind of advertising revenue to support having newspaper reporters stationed around the world, and neither does it make sense for a local reporter. So the Associated Press was formed, and what they did then and what they do now is they send these reporters around the world. Then they sell their stories to all these other publications. But they're not sold story by story. Essentially what it is that they sell the rights, or essentially a subscription to the Associated Press. So the Ventura County Star can have a world news section and a national news section and have reputable Associated Press reporters covering the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention without having to send reporters there, because again, it doesn't make sense for them. Now the New York Times, the LA Times will send their own reporters, but they also have Associated Press rights and subscriptions as well. So that's what the wire services are, and really they were the first reporters with the 24-hour news deadline, meaning that they couldn't do what a normal a regular reporter could do. Well, it's 5 o'clock, I've turned in my story, paper goes to bed at 11 o'clock, there'll be nothing new until tomorrow morning. Well, that was never the case for Associated Press reporters, because somewhere in the world it was time for another newspaper to be put to bed and printed and delivered. And so they always had that 24-hour deadline. Okay, here were some of the contributions of the penny press era. As I mentioned, it promoted literacy because it made it easier and more accessible, and empowered the public in governmental affairs. In that very first slide, I said one of the reasons to read newspaper is to become an informed citizen so you can make informed decisions, and that's exactly what newspapers did for the masses. It's an effect not to be underestimated, because when the masses have more decisions, when they have more information, they can make different kinds of decisions. Okay, well, here was a fun era in oops, excuse me, there's my beagle out there. This was a fun era, this yellow journalism period in the history of U.S. newspapers. Yellow journalism, most people know as a sensationalist, get the story first and figure out the facts later, and very much inflated kind of reporting and kind of dirty in a way. Well, let me tell you where that term comes from. It comes from this comic, and this comic was called The Yellow Kid. And this was during a period that was highly competitive in New York, when the major cities in our country and around the world had multiple newspapers. And so the New York Journal, which belonged to William Randolph Hearst, and the New York World, which belonged to Joseph Pulitzer, were battling for circulation. And so what they were doing was essentially stealing each other's employees back and forth, and each other's columnists. And one of the things they stole back and forth was this, the writer of this very popular comic, because it was one of the very first comics in newspapers, and it was called The Yellow Kid comic strip. And so that's how that period got its name of yellow journalism. But I want to caution that this period also was the era in which essentially investigative journalism was kind of founded. It was during an era when they exposed some corruption in business. But before I go too much into that part of it, here's a picture from the movie Citizen Kane, and that one was based very loosely, well, but not very well disguised, on the life of William Randolph Hearst, and that's Orson Welles, who played him and directed the movie. Almost lost his ability to work in Hollywood after that because it was so critical of William Randolph Hearst, and he owned a media empire, and at that time he just shut down the, he wouldn't let any of his writers review this movie, and was very, very much anti-Orson Welles after this, and certainly very hard on this RKO studio. But in this movie, they depict William Randolph Hearst as very sensationalist. He's alleged to have said about the Spanish-American War, you supply the pictures, I'll supply the war. But here's some of the other stuff that, well, actually, I think I'm going to skip ahead and I'll come back to that one. In the same era were investigative journalists and journalists like Nellie Bly. She was one of the first women to be a journalist at all, let alone an investigative journalist. And one of the things that she did, she had to work to get her job with the World. And at first they just let her kind of patted her on the head and said, okay, let's see what you can do. And one of the things that she did was get herself essentially committed to Blackwell's Asylum. And this was an insane asylum for women. And one of the things that she did was expose how horribly women were treated there. They were, given cold showers, fully dressed 3 times a day, and sometimes stark naked, and just subjected to electric shock. And anybody could commit a woman because they essentially had no rights then. And so sometimes women were just committed because their husbands wanted to get rid of them. And it was a pretty awful situation. And she later also investigated jails and how women were treated in jails. So out of this period came some pretty good stuff, and among them was the idea that Joseph Pulitzer, who was back and forth with William Randolph Hearst and sensationalist and all of that in that era, also, I'm sure that name is familiar to you, the Pulitzer Prize. It's the most coveted prize in journalism, and so out of that era came some very good stuff as well for newspapers and for journalists. Let me come back here. Okay, so that era also, as we left the 20s and went into the 30s and 40s, around the 50s, there was reporters and editors began to really distance themselves from this kind of yellow journalism, sensationalist stuff. As our readership became more educated and even more affluent, they kind of developed a more modern model of objectivity, which holds today. This is today's value in journalism, that when you read a story, you shouldn't know what the author's position is. You should just read it. The facts should be presented. And that's, of course, unless you're reading something from an editorial page or a column where you would expect the writer, the author, to have a point of view. But then it would be identified, and so you would know that, okay, this is a column or an editorial or an opinion story, and so therefore not expected to be objective. Still expected to be correctly and accurately reported with sources, but you would expect to see the writer's opinion, which you wouldn't in a regular news story. Okay, after the objective standard in journalism became pretty, firmly instilled, and as I said, remains today, we also saw this kind of a literary style of journalism, and that included Mark Twain, whose books, told a lot about the well, probably everyone's read Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer, and you read about what the through those two characters what the life was like for African Americans. Also Tom Wolfe, whose story Bonfire of the Vanities was a huge hit a couple decades ago. And then of course this picture of Hunter S. Thompson and his many forms of journalism, including what became known as gonzo journalism. He at one point rode with the Hells Angels, almost got himself killed doing it too. But others, Truman Capote, Joan Didion, who recently died, Norman Mailer. So a more of a modern journalism. But as I said, the age of objectivity stands. This is the current model of journalism. We want stories objective. But one of the things that did change early on for some stories in some newspapers is this idea of the smaller, shorter news story. Some people derisively called it News McNuggets because they were shorter in USA Today. And you still see this is, for whatever reason, it's the newspaper of choice for many hotels. And gets more stories on the front, finishes them on the front, doesn't make you keep turning pages to read them. They also brought in color and eventually multimedia sources, meaning that you could now on any newspaper website you can also see multimedia. You can also see video. This one was fun. This was a video on a screen grab from a video about troops in Iraq. So that one, you know, you could actually see it going on. But this one isn't the best example. There are many that are more vivid or interactive now on newspaper sites online. So go to latimes.com and look, or nytimes.com. New York Times actually has a lot of multimedia. And then there below you see some of the other wire services that are around today. It's not just Associated Press, Reuters, Agence France, United Press. Actually UPI I think is out of business, and New York Times News Service as well. Okay, let's talk a little about the economic demands in newspapers today. There was a time when any ad on the front page of a newspaper, it was considered not just a faux pas, but it's just something that wasn't done. It's nothing that any newspaper of any repute would consider. And this picture that you see here on this slide is not a real front page. It was what's called a wrap around the front page. It's kind of a faux front page with this advertisement on it, but it was the first time it was made to look like a front page of the paper. Actually, I think this was the second one. There was another one before this. And, you know, it grabbed a lot of people's attention, but it was very shocking to some readers. So let's look at why this happened. Essentially, well, I'll show you in the next slide why this happened. Here's what happened in revenue for newspapers. And mind you, this is if our recession began in late 2007 or early 2008. By 2009, 2010, it had hit hard newspapers. By then, also there were new outlets for the advertising dollar. There was cable, and you see here online, and that was a good thing for newspapers. Network television, audio, magazines became very flat, and newspapers actually declined. Now, if you look at online, they were spending, it's true, advertisers were spending more money online, but not as much in newspapers. They're spending more money on, they're spending some online. In fact, revenue for online online revenue in newspapers is going up. It used to compile, even 10 years ago, it was only about 5% of all the money that newspapers made, and now it's about 25%. So the model's evening itself out, but that means that 75% still comes from, of the newspaper's revenue still comes from print. And with print readership declining, that means the amount of money they can charge for newspaper ads in print is declining. So they need to make more of a transition to really make their business models work. As for the readership decline, I'm showing this kind of a 50s looking image of a man, you know, reading a morning newspaper, and his wife puts food on the table. It does look like they're a little bit modern because she's dressed and looks like she's going off to work as well. So I don't know if the kids are getting ready to be dropped off at daycare or what. But you still see the tradition of reading the morning paper. And in many households, that is no longer a tradition today. So let's look at for a minute at who newspaper readers are. Essentially, if you look at by age group, your age group has the fewest newspaper readers. And this is something that I hope reverses itself. When I think about myself as a young adult in college, I didn't read the newspaper much, and you know, that turned out to be my career in news, and now in journalism, teaching you guys about it. But as a young adult, you know, even though there was a lot going on in the 70s when I was, you know, going through college, I still didn't read the newspapers that much. I snippets here and there. And I'm hoping that as you all, you know, grow and mature into young adults and take your place in the world as the standard bearer for the country for the next generation, that you'll become more interested as well. And that, you know, maybe this chart will always look the same, that young people will always be the ones who are reading the least news. But that's okay, as long as when you move into the next bracket, the 30 to 40-year-old range, that your readership goes up. And that's my belief that it will, because I think this generation of young people will want to know what's going on in the world and will want to make informed decisions. And there you have it by race and by ethnicity, and you see who most of the newspaper readers are. Oh, let me look back by education. Generally, the more educated people read newspapers, and that's something to keep in mind too. It's a great way to become educated. I'm going to skip that slide. Basically, it says that, I'll put it back on. It says that the number of daily newspapers in our country has declined. But one of the things to think about is that we now have maybe fewer news companies that are putting out news in a single area. But the news potentially can go to a much wider readership because it's online, it's immediate, it's searchable, and it's archivable. And it has, as you see here, it has more photos, it has more multimedia, and it can be personalized. Currently, as I said before, I showed that the youth was trending away from reading, but as I said before also, I'm hoping that this youth will go back into reading more news as you go out into society and take your place as an informed consumer of mass communications. And that's it for now for newspapers.